Welcome back to our latest explainer for The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. We've previously delved into the peoples of Middle-earth and where they are at the start of the Second Age. And we've also explored the histories and stories of the main characters that we'll meet throughout the series. But the biggest question, at least for me, is when exactly does the Rings of Power take place? Thanks again for joining me as I explore all the little details and lore of Middle-earth so that you'll have everything you need to know before starting The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. You can check out my previous explainers, which I'll link to in the description below, or you can check out all of the cool articles and deep dives that we have for you over on Nerdist.com. Today, I'll be theorizing about when exactly the Rings of Power takes place, based on timelines established in the Silmarillion and Tolkien's writings. So if you don't want to be spoiled, go take some time as we go back in time before it's too late.
A wizard is never late, Frodo Baggins. Nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.
Okay, from the synopsis, we know that the Rings of Power takes place during the Second Age. For reference, in the history of Middle-earth, time has been measured with the years of the Valar, the years of the trees, the First Age, the Second Age, and finally the Third Age, which is when the Lord of the Rings takes place. Now, in the trailer, we hear Gil-galad say, "Today our days of peace begin." But which days of peace exactly? With the Second Age lasting about 3,400 years and ending with the defeat of Sauron during the last alliance of elves and men, that's a lot of time for these stories to happen. Add in the fact that many of these main characters are immortal or have longer lifespans, plus the use of what looks like plenty of flashbacks in the trailers, the exact time period for Rings of Power can be hard to nail down. I expect the Rings of Power to begin with another prologue from Galadriel, similar to the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. So let's at least begin with what I believe Galadriel will explain to us, starting with the years of the trees and the events of the First Age. So long before the Second Age, the Valar, the powerful beings that shaped and rule over the world of Arda, created two trees. We can see in these shots the golden tree, Laurelin, and the silver tree, Telperion, which lit the world before the Valar created the sun and the moon. Feanor, a great leader and craftsman among the elves, created three jewels, called Silmarils, and they contained light from these trees. The evil Melkor destroyed the trees and stole these Silmarils, and Feanor and his sons vowed to get them back. I believe we actually see his sons taking the Oath of Feanor in this shot. Their actions would lead to the exile of many elves to the lands of Beleriand and Middle-earth, and begin the War of the Jewels. Galadriel also has flashbacks about her brother, Finrod Felagund, who we see in the Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. Another flashback shows his death after he sacrificed himself to save Beren, one of Aragorn's ancestors. Finally, we see Galadriel setting a helmet on a pile of remaining elven armor, after either the Dagor Bragollach or possibly the War of Wrath, which ended the First Age. But what about events of the Second Age then? With Gil-galad's line, "Our days of peace begin," it would make sense that he is referring to the very beginning of the Second Age, right after the War of Wrath. During this time, survivors of the First Age had begun resettling into Middle-earth, or sailed across the sea to the Undying Lands with the Valar. The Edain, the race of men who fought with the elves against Morgoth, sailed to the new island of Numenor. These migrations would place the series at the beginning of the Second Age, but then in the trailer, we hear rumblings of Sauron's return.
Somehow Sauron has returned.
After the War of Wrath, Sauron went into hiding and wouldn't really begin re-emerging until about the year 500 of the Second Age. Over the next 1,000 years or so, Sauron would slowly raise new armies of orcs, trolls, and other dark creatures, as well as build his tower fortress of Barad-dûr in Mordor. He would then spread his influence and corruption to the races of men throughout the east and the south. Theo and his mother Bronwyn hail from Tir-Horod, a place rumored to be near the south of Middle-earth, and we can see that Theo is already coming into contact with some form of dark sorcery. So this brings us roughly 1,500 years into the Second Age. And the year 1500 is interesting because that was the time that the Rings of Power were forged. Now, why does that sound familiar? Oh, right. Around this time, Sauron would eventually take on the form of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, so that he could attempt to influence and corrupt the elves. Annatar would begin teaching the elves, including Celebrimbor, the art of forging these rings of power, like the 9 rings for kings of men and the 7 rings for the dwarf lords. Sauron would then forge the One Ring in the year 1600, and then start the War of Elves and Sauron in his attempt to collect all of the rings for himself in 1693. But have the Rings of Power even been created by this point in the show? We know from the trailers that we'll meet Celebrimbor, who created the Elven Rings of Power himself. We also know that the dwarves will discover the giant veins of mithril ore in Khazad-dûm. Galadriel's ring, for instance, is actually made out of mithril. So we may see the time that Celebrimbor and the other elves have moved to Eregion near Khazad-dûm and are about to forge the rings once they meet Annatar. Great! So the Rings of Power takes place roughly around the year 1500 of the Second Age, right? Not so fast. Remember these guys? Elendil and Isildur? They're in this series as well. And as my last video explains, Elendil and Isildur are Númenóreans and part of the line of Elros, granted with long lifespans. We see an instance here of Númenóreans present in Middle-earth, which could be anywhere between the year 750 and 3200. But Elendil isn't born until 3119 of the Second Age, and Isildur, his son, isn't born until 3209. Add in other Númenórean characters like Miriel, born in 3117, and Pharazôn, born in 3118, and you're looking at a time period roughly 1500 to 1600 years after the Rings of Power were forged. Also remember that the last alliance of elves and men defeats Sauron only a few hundred years later in 3441, so we're already approaching the end of the Second Age. Confused yet? Not only do we have such a large jump in time, but we also meet the Stranger, a starman racing through the sky who looks like he's cosplaying as Gandalf. Gandalf wouldn't come to Middle-earth until the Third Age, but the Stranger could simply be Olorin. Olorin is one of the Maiar who walked among the people of Middle-earth long before the First Age. But it's in the Third Age, when the wizards are sent to Middle-earth, that Olorin could finally take the form of, and from then on be known as, Gandalf the Grey.
And Gandalf means... me.
We also meet a Balrog, which may or may not be the same as Durin's Bane, the Balrog that we meet in the Fellowship of the Ring. But the dwarves don't really awaken Durin's Bane in Moria until well into the Third Age. And lastly, returning to Galadriel, all we know of her time in the Second Age is her movement from Eregion and then on to Lothlórien. We do see Galadriel and Elendil on horseback on their way to what could be Andúnië, the home of the faithful on the western coast of Númenor. As for her other adventures that we see in the trailers, those could be whenever she wants them to be. I'm certainly not going to get in her way. So everything I've laid out here are at least the major events of the Second Age that we know have timestamps in Tolkien's writings. But will the Rings of Power have to rely on multiple flashbacks or flash forwards or parallel plot lines all taking place at different times? Possibly. But because of the vast period of time that this show seems to cover, I think the teasers and trailers may already be revealing scenes that we won't see until the series' final season. The Rings of Power showrunners J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay have said that they have laid out a strict 5-season plan and that they already know what the final shot of the series will be. So they've got time.
All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
We'll find out soon enough when The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power begins on September 2nd. I hope these explainers have been helpful and haven't made you bored of the rings, am I right? Well, if you want even more deep dives into the Rings of Power, we've got you covered on Nerdist.com. But tell us, what do you think? What major events do you want to see in the Rings of Power? And when exactly do you think this show takes place?
It is 10 o'clock in the morning. On October the 24th, if you want to know.
Let us know in the comments below, and for the latest and greatest in all of Middle-earth, stay tuned to Nerdist.com.